So I love being a Catholic. For all sorts of reasons, I completely agree with G.K. Chesterton, who once wrote, "The difficulty of explaining why I'm a Catholic is that there are 10,000 reasons, all amounting to one reason, that Catholicism is true." Now, true is not the same as popular or that which is held by the majority, especially perhaps today. Catholic faith's neither popular nor held by most people in our culture. But this was also the case when Christianity emerged in the first century in the Roman Empire. Non-Christians were often attracted by some elements of Christian faith, but they were also offended by some of the Christians' beliefs as well. Amongst other things, the early church possessed a distinctive social project that strongly distinguished it from the culture around it. There are at least 5 beliefs and practices that distinguish the Christians from their non-Christian or pagan neighbours. The first one is that the church was multi-ethnic. In the Roman world, people were born into their religion. Each country, each tribe had their own gods, and so you inherited the religion depending on where you were born. It was part of being a member of this people group or that people group. The Christians, on the other hand, believed in one God, and to believe in God was a deeper allegiance than that owed to family or to tribe or to nation. It meant that the church became essentially multi-ethnic because what united them was belief in the God of Jesus Christ and not their cultural or ethnic background. Secondly, in the Roman world, you had obligations to your family and tribe, but you didn't need to care for those who were poor or suffering who didn't belong to your tribe. Whereas Christians, on the other hand, inspired and challenged by the parable of the Good Samaritan, considered anyone to be their neighbour, regardless of their religious or ethnic identity. The early Christians didn't just care for their own poor and needy, they cared for anybody who was in need. This was a remarkable level of commitment to the poor, a level previously unknown in the ancient world. Thirdly, the early Christians also distinguished themselves from the society around them by their renunciation of revenge, by their commitment to forgiveness. When they were wronged, they didn't retaliate, but they instead built a community that was committed to peacemaking and to reconciliation. Fourth, the Roman world did not have a problem with abortion or infanticide, but the early Christians did. However, the early church did not simply declare opposition to these practices, but instead cared for those infants who'd been abandoned and left to die. And then fifth, where the Roman world possessed a sexual ethic that required married women to be faithful to their husbands, Roman men could sleep with whomever they chose, so long as the person was of a lower class. On the other hand, Christianity's sexual ethic required that all sexual acts belonged within marriage, because conjugal union was a mutual self-giving that required both husband and wife to give themselves irrevocably to one another. This ethic was much more respectful and empowering of women and helps to explain women's attraction to Christianity in the first centuries of the church. Throughout the centuries since and long after the Roman Empire had disintegrated, the church has been called to continue the commitment of being multi-ethnic, committed to the poor and to justice, to being pro-life, and to being faithful to its unique and revolutionary sexual ethic. And in an age today where people delight in outrage and love to cancel someone they disagree with, Christians are still called to practice radical forgiveness and reconciliation, even and especially when we've been wronged. Some people in the church today pride themselves on being committed to a diverse, multi-ethnic church that's committed to the poor and the marginalised. They might be labelled by some as progressive or liberal Catholics, whereas other Catholics might be completely dedicated to being pro-life and to the church's sexual ethic. and these folk are sometimes labelled as conservative Catholics. The ways in which different groups can champion these two positions can be polarising and divisive in our church today. In so doing, people often leave that commitment to reconciliation and peacemaking behind as well. We're still called to hold these 5 elements together in our church today. Why is that? Well, the same logic underpins all 5 elements, and we see that logic at work in the gospel today. In the gospel today, the disciples have been fighting about who is the greatest, and Jesus' response is to tell them, and therefore also to tell us, what discipleship, what following Jesus should actually look like. If you want to be first, make yourself last. In fact, be a servant, says Jesus, a servant of all. Then Jesus takes a child. And that actually makes a lot of sense because the word for servant, which he's just been speaking about, and the word for child in both Greek and Aramaic are the same word. And Jesus says, if you receive a child in the name of Jesus, in his name, you receive him. You receive Jesus. Now, we live in a time that often reveres the child. And that's actually because Western culture has been deeply shaped by Jesus' teaching here. But to the time that Jesus was speaking to the people of that time, Jesus' words would have been deeply shocking. Because in the ancient world, children were not the centre of family life. The child was actually a non-person, someone with no legal rights or status in society. Jesus is saying here that it's of the very essence of discipleship, of following Jesus, to have a special esteem, a special care for those that the culture considers to be non-persons. That is a deep and practical commitment for those who are most helpless and seemingly inconsequential. In the Roman Empire, those non-persons included children and non-Roman racial minorities, the poor, as well as women and men of the lower classes who were the playthings of the wealthy and the powerful. Do you see how the same logic then underpins the church's commitment to a multi-ethnic church, to racial equality, to the poor and to justice, to being pro-life, and to the church's marriage ethic? It's because these seemingly diverse moral positions actually rest on the same principle, that all persons are persons, and followers of Jesus welcome those that the culture considers non-persons, because we actually believe that Jesus is present in the baby and the child, in the racial minority, in the poor and oppressed, in the exploited and degraded. Jesus goes even further. He says when you receive a child, a non-person in his time, you receive God, the one who sent Jesus. How we treat the lowly, the seeming nobodies in the eyes of the world, is actually a measure of how we're treating God. I mentioned earlier that secular Western culture tends to revere children and babies, and that this is due to Jesus' radically different attitude to children. But of course, that's not always true in our culture. There's a profound and tragic inconsistency in our culture's attitude to children today. To many people today, the baby in utero is still a non-person. But that's only the case if the baby is not wanted. If you buy a bottle of wine today, there's a mandatory warning on the label not to drink alcohol if you're pregnant, because it can harm the baby. Yet it's completely legal to abort the same child. Fetal alcohol poisoning gravely damages a child in utero. But of course, an abortion ends that same life. This inconsistency is really illogical, but it's deeply held in our culture. As we've seen today, Catholics are pro-life because we believe there are no non-persons, and how we treat a baby in the womb actually reflects how we treat God. I'm deeply conscious that there'll be people in the church today whose lives have been touched by abortion in one way or another. I spent a lot of time listening to women who bear the scars of their decisions. As I've assured those women, I want to assure everyone in the church today of the unconditional love and unconditional mercy of God. There is nothing that you or I have ever done that's unforgivable. Please don't hear the message today as a word of condemnation, but actually as an invitation to discover just how deep the love and mercy of God goes. I'd like to invite you to the sacrament of reconciliation. Through this sacrament, the Lord wants you to experience not only forgiveness and mercy, but also healing of that scar, of that wound. Despite the rhetoric that often surrounds these choices today, these decisions are often the result of pressure and even coercion from others. To have done this to a woman's not unforgivable either, but I'd also ask people who've done that to make this right with God also by coming to the sacrament of reconciliation as well. For various reasons, men can carry guilt around abortion, and Jesus is waiting for you in the sacrament of reconciliation too. I also want to promise that anyone, female or male, who comes to the sacrament to confess this will be met with great gentleness, with love and respect. The Lord wants to bring his freedom and his peace to you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the homily, the early church was very practically pro-life, and we need to be practically pro-life today too. If someone faces an unplanned pregnancy, I promise the parish will support you. To help you practically care for your child. To end where we began, the Catholic Church has always held to some very unpopular opinions. The reason for that is that the Church resolutely believes that nobody is a non-person. Not the child, not the baby in the womb, not the racial minority, not the poor, not women, not those liable to sexual exploitation. Our Church's position here is deeply consistent, and it comes from Jesus himself, which means it's also good for us. It's good for human beings, for all human beings. It's also beautiful because it upholds the dignity and value of every person. And all of that means that while the Church's teaching is frequently unpopular today, it's still the truth. And Jesus' promise is that the truth will always set us free.